The moment Phineas Easton rode up to the smoldering wreckage of the Covington wagon, he knew this job was going to be far more complicated than the $20 he had been promised. The wagon listed hard to the left, its rear axle snapped clean through, and one of its wheels spinning lazily in the dry Arizona wind like it had not yet received word that everything was already over. The mule that had been pulling it stood some 30 yards off, cropping at a cluster of brittle grass as though the whole catastrophe was none of its business. And there, perched on a scorched wooden crate in the middle of the Sonoran Desert in the year of our Lord 1873, sat a woman with red dust in her dark hair and fury in her green eyes, calmly reading a leather-bound book as if she were in a Boston parlor. Phineas pulled his roan gelding, Fletcher, to a stop and pushed his hat back on his head. "You Opal Covington," he called down. She did not look up from the page. "Depends entirely on who is asking and what they intend to do about it." He had been warned. The man who had hired him, a banker in Tucson by the name of Gerald Covington, had pressed 3 folded bills into Phineas's palm and said, with the expression of a man explaining how to defuse a cannon, "My sister is strong-willed and does not suffer fools. Get her to Millhaven by Friday, and there is another 20 in it for you." He had not said anything about the sister being beautiful, which seemed to Phineas like the kind of detail a man ought to mention when asking another man to spend several days alone in the desert with her. "My name is Phineas Easton," he said. "Your brother hired me to bring you to Millhaven." She turned a page. "I did not realize Gerald had stooped to hiring escorts. He usually just sends strongly worded letters." "The letters were not getting you anywhere fast," Phineas said, swinging down from Fletcher and tying the reins loosely to the broken wagon tongue. "What happened here?" "The axle gave out about 6 miles past the Canoa Ranch Road," she said, finally closing her book and looking up at him. "The driver, a man named Hector Ruiz, rode the mule back to Canoa to get help 3 hours ago." "I have been waiting." Phineas looked at the angle of the sun. "Hector is not coming back, Miss Covington, not today. That mule will have given out half a mile from here, and Canoa is too far by foot in this heat. If Hector is smart, he found shade and is waiting for the temperature to drop." Something shifted behind her eyes. Not fear, precisely, but the very first acknowledgement that the situation was more serious than her composed posture had suggested. She set the book on top of the crate and stood, and he saw that she was taller than he had expected, slender but not slight, with the kind of posture that came from a lifetime of being told she took up too much space and deciding not to care. "You are saying I have been sitting here alone in the desert for 3 hours waiting for a man who is not coming," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "And Gerald sent you?" "Yes, ma'am." She exhaled through her nose. "Of course he did." She smoothed the front of her traveling dress, which was practical brown wool, not the sort of delicate thing women wore in city illustrations of the frontier. She had clearly been out here before. "Well, Mr. Easton, I suppose we had better load what matters onto that horse of yours and be on our way. Fletcher can carry 2 if we are not going hard," he said. "We will not be going hard. There is no reason to rush." She picked up the crate and carried it toward him, and he noticed her arms were not weak. "I want to stop at the Kessler homestead before we reach Millhaven." He had already picked up the other bag, a heavy carpet bag stuffed with what felt like an entire library. "The Kessler homestead is not on the road to Millhaven." "I know where it is, Mr. Easton. It will add 2 days." She looked at him with those green eyes, and something in them told him that she had been having this particular category of argument, the kind where she already knew she was right, for the entirety of her 26 years. "Yes, it will." Phineas loaded the bags across Fletcher's haunches and checked the straps twice, because he needed something to do with his hands that was not stand there getting flustered. He was 31 years old, and had escorted 3 different people across the Arizona Territory in the last 2 years. A judge, a land commissioner, and a Catholic priest, none of whom had managed to inconvenience him on the very first minute of a job. He put his boot in the stirrup and mounted, then reached down and offered her his hand. She looked at the hand, then at the horse, then made a decision. She gripped his wrist with both of hers, and he pulled her up behind him with a single practiced motion, and she settled onto Fletcher's back behind the saddle with a composure that told him she had ridden before, and possibly ridden better than he had. "The Kessler homestead," he said, pointing Fletcher south-southwest and nudging him forward. "Why?" "Because Martha Kessler is 63 years old and her husband died last winter, and she is trying to hold onto 40 acres of land against a man named Aldous Crane who wants to buy it for less than it is worth," Opal said from behind him, her voice matter of fact. "I have legal documents in that carpetbag that can help her contest his offer, drawn up by a solicitor in Tucson who owes me a considerable favor. I have been carrying them for 3 weeks. Phineas rode in silence for a moment, digesting this. "You were already delayed 3 weeks. I was gathering the documents. Things take time when they are worth doing correctly. Your brother is going to have my hide if we do not make Millhaven by Friday." "My brother," she said with magnificent calm, "will survive the disappointment." The afternoon sun drove itself into the red earth like a brand, and Phineas settled into the rhythm of the trail, watching the horizon out of professional habit, scanning the ridgelines and the arroyos for anything that moved in a way that required attention. The Arizona Territory in 1873 was not a particularly gentle place. The Apache Wars had quieted somewhat but had not ended, and there were enough desperate men between Tucson and the Santa Cruz River to keep an Escort in steady employment if he was not picky about the hours. But the land was also beautiful in a way that Phineas had spent years pretending not to notice, because a man who noticed beauty was a man who was not watching the ridgelines. The saguaro stood in great silent processions across the hillsides, the late afternoon light turning them gold at the edges, and the distant mountains were that particular shade of blue-purple that existed only in the desert and only at this hour. "You have been doing this long?" Opal asked after a while. "Escorting, riding for hire. Whatever it is that you do." "About 4 years," he said. "Before that I was with the Army, 3rd Cavalry out of Fort Grant." A pause. "And before that?" He was not accustomed to people asking what came before the Army. Most people started the timeline there because it was the most dramatic point on offer. "I had a farm in Missouri," he said. "My father's farm. Had. He sold it when he needed the money and I was away. By the time I came back there was nothing to come back to." She did not offer the usual condolences, which would have been meaningless anyway. Instead she said, "Is that why you stayed out here?" "Partly," he said. "Partly because out here a man can be something other than what he was born into." He felt her shift slightly behind him. "I understand that impulse very well," she said, and the way she said it, quietly and without drama, told him that she meant it in a way that had teeth behind it. They made camp that night in the shelter of a limestone outcropping near a small tank of standing water that Phineas knew from previous crossings. He built a fire small enough to avoid drawing attention and unpacked the bedrolls, giving her the better one, which was wool-lined and which she accepted without protest, but with a nod that acknowledged the gesture. She cooked, which surprised him. Not because women did not cook, obviously, but because she cooked well and without fuss, producing a meal of salt pork and dried beans and cornbread from the supplies in his saddlebag that was considerably better than what he managed on his own, and she did it the way competent people do things, without making a performance of the competence. "Tell me about Gerald," he said, because it seemed like useful intelligence. She handed him a tin plate and sat across the fire from him. "Gerald is 40 years old and believes that his primary function in my life is to make decisions about it. He is not a cruel man. He is simply a man of his time, which unfortunately is also my time." He seemed worried about you. "Gerald is always worried about me when I am doing something he did not sanction." She broke a piece of cornbread in half. "I came out to Arizona Territory on my own accord 8 months ago, Mr. Easton. I came because there is work here that matters, helping homesteaders understand their land rights. documenting the conditions of the people the government has seen fit to relocate to reservations, writing about it for papers that are willing to print the truth. Gerald thinks I came out here to have an adventure and then get it out of my system. Phineas looked at her across the fire. The light moved across her face in amber waves, and she was watching the flames with an expression of such settled conviction that he felt something in his chest do something inconvenient. "And have you gotten it out of your system?" he asked. She looked up at him. Not even slightly. He almost smiled. He stopped himself because smiling was the kind of thing that led to other things, and he was being paid to deliver this woman to her brother without incident, and he was a professional. "Get some sleep, Miss Covington," he said, instead of smiling. "We have a long ride tomorrow." She looked at him for a moment as if she could see the smile he had not let himself have. Then she said, "Good night, Mr. Easton," and settled into her bedroll with her book and her unshakable composure, and Phineas sat up and watched the dark for another 2 hours before allowing himself to sleep. They were back in the saddle before dawn, the sky still purple and cold above the desert, the stars retreating westward like they had somewhere else to be. Opal sat behind him and did not complain about the cold, which impressed him because the desert at that hour was genuinely cold in November, the kind of chill that found the spaces between your buttons and settled in. She did not lean against him either, which he noticed because he was aware of the precise amount of space she maintained between herself and the back of his coat, which was approximately 1 inch, and which fluctuated only when Fletcher picked his way over rough ground. By mid-morning they were into the foothills, and the air was beginning to warm. A pair of ravens tracked them from ridge to ridge, keeping their distance but keeping pace, which Phineas had always found mildly companionable in the way that silent company sometimes was. "What do you know about Aldous Crane?" he asked. "More than he would like," she said. "He came down from Prescott 2 years ago with money from a railroad land consortium and has been buying up the smaller homesteads in the Santa Cruz Valley. The Kesslers were the first families out here, 40 years. They built that land from nothing." "The railroad money is a problem," Phineas said. "Men with that kind of backing do not give up easily." "No," she agreed, "which is why the documents matter. The Homestead Act gives Martha the right to that land so long as she has continuously worked it for 5 years. She has been there 40, with her son's labor on top of her own. There is no legitimate legal argument for Crane to dispossess her." "Legitimate and legal are not always the same thing out here. That," she said, "is precisely why I brought a solicitor's documents instead of just a letter of encouragement." They stopped at noon to rest Fletcher and eat from the supplies, sitting in the thin shade of a Apollo verd tree. Opal pulled off her hat, which was a practical, wide-brimmed thing she had retrieved from the wagon before they left, and fanned herself with it, and Phineas looked at the line of her neck against the bright sky and looked away again immediately. "You are from Missouri," she said, picking up the thread of the previous day's conversation as naturally as if it had not been interrupted by 8 hours and 40 miles. "Born there," he said. "Boonville. My father raised tobacco and corn and was not particularly good at either." "And your mother?" "Died when I was 11, fever." "I am sorry," she said, and unlike most condolences of that sort it sounded genuine rather than reflexive. "Mine died when I was 9. My father remarried quite quickly after, which at the time I found offensive and in retrospect I understand better. Gerald is from the first marriage. Gerald is from the first marriage. He was 17 when our mother died and he has been trying to manage everything since, including me." She said it without particular bitterness, like a woman describing the weather in a place she had lived long enough to accept. "He has good intentions. He simply has no idea what to do with a woman who does not want to be managed." "What does he want you to do in Millhaven?" She was quiet for a moment, reseating her hat with precise adjustments. "There is a man in Millhaven named Douglas Hargrove who has expressed interest in marrying me. Gerald thinks it would be an excellent arrangement. Douglas is 38, well-established, has a fine house and respectable accounts." Phineas kept his voice entirely neutral. "And what do you think?" "I think that Douglas Hargrove has excellent accounts, and that I would be bored to the point of dissolution within 6 months." She stood, dusting off her skirt. "I think Gerald has a fundamental misunderstanding of what I require from a life. I think I had better get those documents to Martha Kessler before Crane makes another move, and then I can deal with the Douglas Hargrove situation in my own way and on my own schedule." Phineas stood and offered Fletcher a handful of the dried corn from the saddlebag. "Your brother really is not going to like that." "No," she agreed cheerfully. "He is not." They rode through the afternoon, and toward evening the landscape shifted, the flat desert giving way to rolling grassland and scattered juniper, the smell of the air changing from hot dust to something cooler and greener. Phineas knew this country, and he knew that the Kessler homestead was perhaps 4 hours ahead, which meant arriving after dark or making another camp. He was running the calculations when he spotted the riders. 3 of them, on a low ridge to the east, just sitting there watching. They were too far away to read clearly, but something in the way they were sitting, the casual stillness of men who were not in a hurry because they had already decided how things were going to go, made the back of Phineas's neck prickle. He did not say anything to Opal. He changed Fletcher's course very slightly south, nudging the horse toward a draw that offered better cover, and spoke in the same conversational tone he had been using all day. "See those riders on the ridge?" She looked. "Yes." "Do not look at them directly again. We are going to move south toward that draw. There is a ranch about 7 miles in that direction where we can ask after them." "You think they are following us?" "I think it is possible, could be Crane's men, could be anyone, could be nobody. I would rather take the long way and feel foolish than take the short way and not." She did not argue, which told him she understood the calculus. They moved toward the draw, and the riders on the ridge shifted, tracking them, and that was all Phineas needed to know. "Hold on," he said quietly. "To what?" "To me." Another brief pause. Then her hands came to rest against his sides, not gripping, just resting, the way a rider holds position, and he nudged Fletcher from a walk to a trot and then to a canter, angling for the draw and the cover of the junipers beyond it. The riders on the ridge moved. They were fast, and there were 3 of them to his 1, and Phineas made rapid calculations about terrain and speed and what he was carrying and what his options were. "Can you handle a rifle?" he asked. "Yes," she said, with no hesitation that told him she was not just saying it. "There is one in the scabbard on the right side. Do not take it out yet. Just know where it is." Fletcher took the draw at a hard angle, and Phineas felt Opal shift her weight expertly with the horse's movement. No panic, no clutching, just adjustment. The junipers closed around them, and the light dropped into green shadow, and Phineas slowed Fletcher to a careful walk, picking their way through the trees without noise. The riders had not followed them into the draw. He could see them on the ridge through gaps in the juniper, and they were conferring, and then one of them turned away and rode north, and the other 2 turned south. "They are splitting," Opal said quietly. "Yes, south is the way we were heading. They think they can cut us off. So we do not go south." "Not directly." He turned Fletcher northeast, deeper into the juniper. "There is a mining camp about 3 miles northeast. They will have men and probably a telegraph. We can get word to the Kesslers that way and come in from a different angle tomorrow." "Phineas," she said, and it was the first time she had used his first name, and it landed with more weight than he had expected. "If those are Crane's men and they know I'm coming to the Kesslers, then Martha Kessler may already be in trouble." He had been thinking the same thing. "One problem at a time," he said. "Right now the problem is getting you somewhere safe. I am not the only one who matters in this situation. You are the one I am responsible for." "That is a remarkably narrow definition of responsibility, Mr. Easton." He did not answer that, because she was right and he knew she was right, and arguing with her would waste time they did not have. He pushed Fletcher northeast, and they moved through the junipers in silence, the horse picking his way with the careful intelligence of an animal that had been in difficult country before. The mining camp was called Dusty Fork, which was not a name that inspired confidence, but it had 16 men, 3 of them armed with repeating rifles, and a telegraph line that ran to Tucson, and those were the things that mattered. The camp foreman, a broad-weathered man named Cal Sweeney, knew Phineas from a previous season and offered them a tent and a hot meal, and a guard on the perimeter without being asked, because Cal Sweeney understood how the territory worked and he had 4 daughters of his own. Phineas sent a telegraph to the Millhaven Sheriff's office, a man named Bart Dahlin whom he had worked with twice before, asking him to ride out to the Kessler homestead and check on the old woman. Then he sent another to a contact in Tucson who dealt in information about land disputes and asked what he knew about Aldous Crane and the Santa Cruz Valley. The replies came back within 2 hours, which was a testament to the efficiency of telegraph operators when the message carried the right urgency. The Tucson contact replied first, and what he said made Phineas read the message twice. He took it to Opal, who was sitting in the foreman's tent with a cup of coffee and the legal documents from her carpetbag spread across a camp table, reviewing them with the focused intensity of a woman preparing for a very particular kind of war. "Crane has filed a competing land claim in the Territorial Land Office," Phineas said, setting the message down in front of her. "He is arguing that the Kessler homestead was abandoned during a 6-month period in 1870 when Martha's husband, Frank, was in the hospital in Tucson following an accident. Crane's claim is that abandonment voids the Homestead Act filing." Opal read the message and set it down. Her eyes went somewhere interior for a moment, working through it. "That is a false claim," she said. "Martha did not abandon the land. She stayed and worked it while Frank was recovering. She had 2 of her sons with her. Can it be proven?" "It can be proven," she said, pulling 3 documents from the stack in front of her. "I have sworn affidavits from the neighbors who were there and the doctor in Tucson who treated Frank. The doctor's statement specifically references letters he received from Martha while Frank was under his care, letters dated from the homestead." Phineas sat down across the table from her. The lamp between them was casting soft yellow light, and she was looking at the documents with that expression of settled ferocity that he was beginning to understand was simply how her face looked when she was certain she was right. "You have been building this case for months," he said. 8 months, she confirmed. "Every document I gathered required another trip, another favor, another piece of patience. Crane has money, I have documentation." She looked up at him. "Documentation wins." "Not always," he said carefully. "Not when the judge is sympathetic to railroad money." She met his eyes. "Then we make sure the judge knows there is a journalist watching." He stared at her. "You are a journalist." "I write for the Arizona Citizen and the Tucson Weekly Arizonan," she said calmly. "Under my own name, which Gerald also finds objectionable, though that is secondary." There was a long moment in which Phineas resorted everything he thought he knew about this job and placed it in a different configuration. Gerald Covington had hired him to escort his troublesome sister to Millhaven. Gerald Covington's troublesome sister was, in fact, a journalist building a legal case against a railroad land consortium who had 3 of Crane's riders on her trail, and who was carrying the documentation to save an elderly widow's 40-year homestead. The $20 escort job was, it turned out, something considerably larger than that. "You should have told me this at the wagon," he said. "I did not know you at the wagon," she said, with perfect logic. "Now I do." Sheriff Dahlin's reply came in just after 9 that evening. Martha Kessler was fine, but 2 of Crane's men had ridden through the property that afternoon and spoken to her in what Dahlin described as a threatening manner. He had posted one of his deputies at the homestead overnight. He was requesting that whoever was coming with the legal documents please arrive as soon as possible. Phineas read the message to Opal. She stood immediately. "We leave at first light." "We leave now," he said. "The moon is enough to ride by and the junipers are behind us. The direct route from here to the Kessler homestead is 8 miles across open country. 4 hours at a good pace." She looked at him, and something crossed her face that was not quite surprise but was adjacent to it, as if she had been prepared to argue for the earlier departure, and did not quite know what to do with a man who had already arrived there on his own. "All right," she said. "Now." They rode under a fat November moon that turned the grassland silver and the distant mountains black, and Fletcher moved with an easy confidence across the open ground, ears up, reading the land the way horses do. Opal rode behind Phineas with her hands resting at his sides, and neither of them spoke much, but the silence had changed from the careful quiet of strangers to something more like the shared attention of two people who are watching the same horizon for the same reasons. "Why did you leave the army?" she asked, somewhere around the second hour. "I disagreed with an order," he said. She waited. "We were instructed to burn a camp," he said. "Apache women and children, most of the men were away. The officer commanding said it was a strategic necessity. I said it was not." He paused. "I said it loudly and with language that was technically insubordinate, and I was given the choice between a court-martial and a discharge." Another silence. "You chose the discharge." "I chose not to give them the satisfaction of a court-martial," he said. "There is a difference." "Yes," she said softly, "there is." Fletcher moved beneath them, and the moon moved above them, and somewhere in the dark a coyote called and was answered by another, and the land stretched out in all directions, vast and indifferent and also, paradoxically, alive. "The things happening on the reservations," she said. "The conditions. What I am writing about." "I know what is happening," he said. "I was there for some of it." "I know you were," she said. "That is why I am telling you." He thought about that for a while. Then he said, "There are editors who will not print it." "There are editors who will," she said. "I have found them." The Kessler homestead was a low adobe building surrounded by a split-rail fence and a kitchen garden that had gone to November brown. There was a lamp burning in the window, and a horse tied at the fence that Phineas recognized as belonging to one of Dahlon's deputies, a young man named Travis Pike, who was sitting on the porch with a rifle across his knees. Martha Kessler came to the door before they had dismounted, a small, white-haired woman with the kind of face that has been weathered into something close to stone but retains, just beneath the surface, a warmth that the weather never quite managed to reach. She saw Opal and her hands went to her mouth. "Child," she said, "you actually came." "I said I would," Opal said, and the way she said it told Phineas that Opal Covington did not say things she did not mean. Martha fed them at the kitchen table, which was an old door set on sawhorses and covered with an oilcloth that had once had a pattern on it, the pattern long since worn to a ghost. There were biscuits and a jar of the previous season's peach preserves and venison stew that Martha said her son James had brought by last week, before Crane's riders had made him nervous about coming around. "They told me," Martha said, sitting across from them, her hands wrapped around a coffee mug, "that the offer was still on the table, and that it was very generous, and that things could go badly for a woman alone if she was not careful." "That is called intimidation," Opal said, spreading the documents across the kitchen table. "And it is exactly the kind of thing that will look very bad in a territorial court and worse in a newspaper." She walked Martha through each document with a patience and clarity that Phineas found remarkable, because the legal language was dense and Opal translated it into plain speech without condescension, explaining not just what each document said, but why it mattered and what it meant for Martha's position. Deputy Pike sat in the corner and listened, and Phineas sat beside Opal and watched her work. She was extraordinary. He had known it in some theoretical way since about the first hour of their acquaintance, but watching her in that lamplit kitchen, with her sleeves rolled up and her hair escaping its pins, and her whole attention bent toward making a 63-year-old widow understand that she had the right to the land she had built her life upon, Phineas felt something settle in him the way the desert settles at the end of a long day, all the heat dropping away and something clear and cool coming up in its place. He realized with the quiet horror of a man who has tried very hard to be sensible, falling in love with her. He stood abruptly and said he was going to check the perimeter, which was a perfectly reasonable thing to say because there were Crane's men in the area, and he went outside and stood in the cold night air, and had a conversation with himself that went approximately nowhere useful. He was being paid to escort her to Millhaven. She was on her way to meet a potential suitor whom her brother had selected. She was a journalist with a mission and a direction and a life that fit together with a particular and specific purpose. He was a man who lived out of saddlebags and slept in camp and had no farm and no fixed address and owned precisely one horse and a good rifle. These were the facts. He arranged them in order and stood in the cold and looked at them. Fletcher nosed his shoulder from the fence rail, looking for corn, and Phineas scratched the horse's jaw and said quietly, "Mind your business." And Fletcher pressed harder against his hand, which was, Phineas thought, exactly the kind of advice horses gave. In the morning, Aldous Crane came himself. He arrived at 10 o'clock with 2 riders and a territorial land surveyor and a leather satchel, the kind that says I have paperwork, and I am not afraid to use it. He was a tall man in his mid-40s with a carefully trimmed dark beard and the clothes of someone who understood that appearances were a form of argument. He tied his horse at the fence and came up the porch steps and knocked on the door with 4 sharp raps, and Phineas answered it. Crane looked at him with the particular assessment of a man who has been dealing with obstacles. "I am here to speak with Mrs. Kessler," he said. "Mrs. Kessler is occupied," Phineas said. "And you are?" "Phineas Easton. I am an interested party." Crane's eyes moved past him to where Opal was visible at the kitchen table, organizing documents with the composure of a woman who had known he was coming. Something moved across Crane's face, a recognition or a recalculation. "Miss Covington," he said, and his voice shifted slightly. "I was told you might be in the area." "Good morning, Mr. Crane," she said pleasantly. "Please come in. I have several things to show you." What followed was 3 hours of the most civil and utterly lethal conversation Phineas had ever witnessed. Opal Covington laid the documents out one by one and walked Crane through each of them with the same patience she had used with Martha the night before, except that with Crane the patience was of a different kind, the patience of a woman who is absolutely certain she has already won and is simply allowing the other party to arrive at the same conclusion at their own pace. The sworn affidavits, the doctor's statement, the land office records showing Martha's continuous payments and improvements, the county tax records proving the land had been taxed in Martha's name throughout the supposed period of abandonment, a detail so simple and so devastating that Phineas actually saw the surveyor wince. Crane tried several angles. He suggested the affidavits were fabricated. Opal pointed out that one of them was signed by Judge Hiram Wells of the 2nd Territorial Circuit, who was not known for fabrication. He suggested the abandonment clause was broadly interpreted. Opal produced a printed copy of the relevant section of the Homestead Act, with the pertinent passage underlined in red ink, that she had apparently been carrying in her carpetbag next to the legal documents. At the end of the 3rd hour, Aldous Crane looked at the table covered in documentation and looked at Opal Covington and said, in the voice of a man who has not often had occasion to use it, "What is it you actually want, Miss Covington?" "I want you to withdraw your competing land claim by close of business Friday," she said. "I want it done in writing, witnessed by Sheriff Dolan and filed with the Territorial Land Office. I want Mrs. Kessler left entirely alone from this point forward." She paused. "And I want to make sure we understand each other regarding what happens if any of those 3 conditions are not met." "And what happens?" Crane asked. "I publish everything," she said simply. "The competing claim, the methods by which it was filed, the identities of the men who threatened this woman in her own yard, and the names of the railroad consortium backing your operation. I have already written the article. I have contacts at 3 papers. It is ready to send." The silence that followed was the silence of a man doing arithmetic and arriving at a number he does not like. Crane closed his satchel. He stood. He looked at Martha Kessler, who was sitting beside Opal with her coffee and her weathered face and her 40 years of stubbornness, and he looked at Opal, And then he looked at Phineas in the way men sometimes look at other men when they are trying to decide whether to make the problem physical. And Phineas looked back at him with an expression that made the decision for him. "Friday," Crane said, and he left. When the sound of his horses had faded, Martha Kessler put her head down on the kitchen table and wept quietly, the way very strong people cry when they have been holding something enormous for a very long time, and someone else has just taken the weight of it. Opal put her hand on the old woman's back and said nothing, which was the right thing to do, and Phineas looked at the ceiling and thought about the kind of person who builds a legal case across 8 months and 300 miles because an old widow deserves to keep her home. He thought about the kind of person who does that, and then he stopped pretending, even to himself, that he was not in love with her. They stayed at the Kessler homestead that night, and the next morning Opal helped Martha write a letter to her son James telling him it was safe to come home, and she helped her draft a formal response to Crane's land office filing that would be waiting for Dahlin when he arrived on Friday. Deputy Pike rode off to fetch the sheriff, and Phineas saddled Fletcher and checked the supplies for the ride to Millhaven, and tried not to think about the fact that Millhaven was where they were going, and what was waiting for them in Millhaven. "We should reach Millhaven by tomorrow evening," he said, when Opal came out of the house with her carpet-bag, lighter now that most of its contents had been delivered to Martha. "Yes," she said. She stood looking at Fletcher for a moment, and then she looked at Phineas and said, "You were going to smile that first day." He blinked. "I beg your pardon. When I said I had not gotten Arizona Territory out of my system," she said. "You almost smiled, and then you stopped yourself." He looked at her. The morning light was doing something specific to the color of her eyes that he was making a very determined effort not to catalog. "I was being professional," he said. "You are always being professional," she said. "It is very admirable and also occasionally very irritating." He put his boot in the stirrup. "Ready to ride, Miss Covington." She took his hand and mounted behind him, and they rode out of the Kessler homestead with Martha standing at the fence watching them go, and Opal turned once and waved, and Martha raised her hand, and then the homestead was behind them and the road stretched ahead toward Millhaven. They rode north through open grassland, the November sky vast and pale blue above them, the Santa Rita Mountains blue-gray to the east. Fletcher moved steadily, and the miles unreeled behind them, and Phineas was very aware of the 12 inches of space between his back and the woman seated behind him, the careful professional distance that he maintained, and that was currently costing him something he had not expected to care about. "Tell me about Millhaven," she said. "Growing town. About 800 people. There is a sawmill and a dry goods and a doctor. Sheriff Dahlin is based there. The railroad has an office, which is how Crane gets his backing. And Douglas Hargrove has the largest house on the main street," Phineas said, because he had asked around, being thorough. "Runs the bank, well thought of." "Honest from what I hear." Another silence. "You asked about him," she said. "I try to know the situations I am riding into. And what did you learn?" "That he is an honest man who runs a bank and has a large house," Phineas said, "and that Gerald Covington has been corresponding with him about the prospect of a match for approximately 4 months. Gerald has been very busy," she said. "He is a man who likes things settled." "And I am an unsettling person," she said, and there was something in it that was not quite sadness but was adjacent to it. "No," Phineas said, before he could stop himself. "You are a person who refuses to be settled into something that is less than what you are." The silence after that was different from the previous silences. It had a different weight and a different texture, and it lasted longer than any of the others. "Phineas," she said, and again his first name in her voice did something to the air around it. "Why did you keep riding past Millhaven to come to the Kessler homestead?" He thought about saying that she had asked him to. He thought about saying that it was part of the job. He thought about saying that the documents were important and the widow needed help, and those things were true. "Because you were right," he said instead, "about it being worth doing." Another pause. "That is not the only reason," she said. He looked at the horizon. Fletcher picked his way along the trail with his ears forward, and the ravens were back, two of them moving along the ridge to the west with their lazy, measuring flight. "No," he said. "It is not." He did not say the rest of it, and she did not push, and they rode on through the long, golden morning with the thing he had not said hanging between them like a held breath, present and patient and waiting. They stopped at noon beside a creek that still had water in it, a relative rarity in November, fed by snowmelt from the mountains above. Fletcher drank and Phineas filled the canteens, and Opal took off her boots and put her feet in the water and made a small, involuntary sound of relief that suggested she had been wanting to do exactly that for approximately 2 days. He sat on a rock and watched her with his boots still on, because if he took his boots off it would feel too much like stopping, and he was not ready to stop. "Gerald is going to be furious," she said, her feet in the cold water, her face tipped up to the sun. "Because of the delay, because of all of it, the Kessler thing, the documents, the article I am going to write about Crane." She paused. "Because I am going to tell Douglas Hargrove that I appreciate the compliment of his interest, but that I am not interested in return." Phineas looked at the water. "He will recover," he said, meaning Hargrove. "Gerald will take longer," she said. "Gerald will be fine," Phineas said. "He is worried about you. When people see that you are fine, they stop worrying." She looked at him then, and the full weight of her attention was a particular thing, like being walked into a room you did not know was there. "Are you saying you think I will be fine?" "I am saying you are the most capable person I have met in 4 years of riding this territory," he said. "And I have met judges and army officers and Apache war leaders and mining foremen and one very memorable Italian countess who got off the stage in Tucson by accident. You are more capable than any of them." She stared at him. Then she laughed. It was the first time he had heard her laugh, and it was like the first water from a pump that has been dry a long time, a little startled and then absolutely real. "An Italian countess," she said. "Long story," he said. "She was fine too, for what it is worth." She was smiling now, the real smile, not the polished social one she had been using on Crane, and which she probably deployed on people she found manageable. This was the other one, the one that changed her whole face. "You are a strange man, Phineas Easton," she said. "I have been told," he said. She pulled her feet out of the water and dried them on the hem of her skirt with practical efficiency and pulled her boots back on. "When we get to Millhaven," she said, "I am going to have to deal with Gerald. I know. It will not be brief. I expect not. And Douglas Hargrove." "Yes." She stood and looked at him sitting on his rock with his boots still on, and his hat tilted against the sun, and his whole face doing the thing it did when it was trying not to do anything in particular. And she said, "After all of that is done, if you were not in a hurry to ride somewhere." He waited. "There is an Apache settlement near Shenega Creek that I have been trying to get access to for my articles," she said. "The people there have been waiting for months for a promised distribution of supplies that has not arrived. I have been trying to document the situation, but I do not know the land well enough to travel it safely alone, and I have not found anyone I trusted enough to ask." He looked up at her. She was looking at him with her green eyes and the sun on her dark hair, and the thing she was and was not saying was perfectly clear to both of them. And the 12 inches of careful professional distance between them was the funniest thing he had encountered in 31 years. "I am not in a hurry to ride anywhere in particular," he said. Something warm moved across her face. "Good," she said. "Then you can come with me." They were in Millhaven by the following evening, just as the last light was going orange over the western hills. The town was bigger than Phineas had described it. Busy in the way that railroad-adjacent towns were busy in 1873, full of men with money and plans and the noise that comes with both. The main street had a hotel and 2 saloons and a telegraph office and the bank with its large front windows, and on the porch of the largest house on the street stood a tall man in a good coat who had the look of a man who had been waiting for a while and was not going to make a scene about it. Gerald Covington was 40 years old and looked 60, and had the expression of a man who had spent the last week revising his reasonable expectations downward. He came down the porch steps when he saw them, and his eyes went first to his sister, checking her over with the automatic inventory of someone who has been imagining catastrophes, and then to Phineas with the assessment of a man who has been paying someone to not let catastrophes happen. "You are 2 days late," Gerald said. "We stopped at the Kessler homestead," Opal said, dismounting from Fletcher with a neat swing that required no help, and adjusted her hat. "It was necessary. I specifically said Millhaven by Friday. And today is Sunday, which is 2 days past Friday and considerably fewer than the several weeks I have spent doing necessary work out here." She kissed him on the cheek with brisk affection. "Gerald, this is Phineas Easton. He did an excellent job. Please pay him the rest of what you owe him." Gerald looked at Phineas with complicated feelings and said, "Yes, come inside." The inside of Gerald's house was the inside of a man who had brought as much of the East with him as he could physically transport: good furniture, good rugs, books on actual shelves. Phineas stood in the front parlor with his hat in his hands, while Gerald counted out the additional $20 and looked as though he wanted to say several things. "Was it very difficult," Gerald asked, finally, "getting her to come here?" Phineas thought about the limestone outcropping and the moonlit ride and the kitchen table covered in legal documents and the creak in the morning and the way she laughed. "She came of her own accord," he said. "She always does." Gerald looked at him. "You know about the Douglas Hargrove situation." She mentioned it. Gerald's shoulders did the things shoulders do when a man has given up on a particular strategy but has not yet decided on an alternative. "Hargrove is a good man," he said, more to himself than to anyone. "From what I hear," Phineas agreed. "She will not have him." "Probably not." Gerald looked up at him. "What are your intentions, Mr. Easton?" he asked with the directness of a man who is tired and has decided that obliqueness is costing him more than it is saving him. Phineas considered this. He thought about what it meant to be asked the question plainly and what it meant to answer it plainly. "I do not know yet," he said honestly. "I have not asked her anything yet. It seemed like the wrong order of operations." Gerald stared at him. "You are going to ask her something." "Eventually," Phineas said, "if she wants to be asked. Which I expect she will tell me, one way or another." For the first time, something that was almost a smile moved across Gerald Covington's tired face. "She will," he agreed. "Lord knows she will." Dinner was a formal thing that Gerald had clearly arranged with some effort. A roast and bread and good wine, and Douglas Hargrove seated across from Opal, looking like a man who had been told everything would work out, and was not entirely sure of the intelligence of whoever told him. He was not unkind, Douglas Hargrove. He was pleasant and attentive, and he spoke to Opal with genuine respect and considerable admiration. He was also, Phineas observed from his end of the table, looking at a woman he admired but did not know, the way you look at a painting you find beautiful without quite understanding what it is of. Opal was gracious throughout dinner and clear in her statement, delivered with Gerald going very quiet across the table and Douglas nodding with the measured dignity of a man who had suspected as much, that she was honored by the interest, but that she was not in a position to accept it, as her life and work were not compatible with what she understood he was looking for. Douglas Hargrove finished his wine and said that he understood entirely and that he wished her well and meant it. And Gerald looked at the ceiling for a moment, and then looked at his wine glass, and then, with the sigh of a man releasing a very long-held thing, poured himself more of it. After dinner, Opal found Phineas on the back porch. She came out without a wrap, which told him she had not planned to stay long, and she stood beside him and looked at the stars over the Santa Ritas, and the air was cold and clear and smelled of juniper smoke. "How was Gerald?" she asked. "He paid me," Phineas said. "He asked what my intentions were." She turned to look at him. "And what did you tell him?" "That I did not have any yet," Phineas said, "because I had not asked you anything yet." "You could ask me something now," she said. The stars were very bright. Fletcher was in Gerald's small stable at the side of the house, and Phineas could hear the horse occasionally shifting his weight, that familiar small sound of a good horse settling. He thought about Missouri and the Army and 4 years of riding other people's routes and sleeping under other people's stars and being always in between one place and another. "I want to come with you to Shenega Creek," he said, "to help you with your work. After that, I would like to know what you need next, and after that the same. I am not proposing anything permanent that you have not agreed to. I am proposing to be useful and to be there and to see what happens." She looked at him for a long moment. The wind came up from the south and moved the loose strands of her hair, and she did not push them back, just stood there looking at him with those green eyes that were doing what they always did, which was see everything. "That is an unusual proposal," she said. "You are an unusual person," he said. "I did not think a conventional proposal would serve." "It would not," she agreed. And then, with the particular decisiveness of a woman who knows her own mind, "Yes, come to Shenega Creek. We will see what happens." He almost smiled. He let himself this time. The smile arrived, and she saw it, and something in her face shifted in response. The warmth that had been there all along coming all the way to the surface. And he was close enough that it would have taken very little movement from either of them. And so he moved slightly. And she moved too. And the kiss was brief and careful and cold from the night air, and tasted like the wine from dinner. And when they stepped back, she was looking at him with an expression he did not have a name for but which he intended to learn. "We should tell Gerald," she said. "He already suspects," Phineas said. "Gerald always suspects," she said. "That does not mean we should not tell him." They stayed in Millhaven for 3 days. Opal filed the article about Crane and the Kessler homestead with 2 different papers, and received a reply from one of them within 24 hours saying they were printing it in the next edition. Crane filed his withdrawal with the land office on Friday morning, which Dahlin confirmed by telegraph, and Martha Kessler's 40 acres was hers, clear and unchallenged, and Opal read the confirmation and sat quietly for a moment in the way people sit when something they have worked very hard for has actually come to pass. Gerald, to his credit, adjusted. He was not a man who made adjustments easily or without protest, but he was a man who loved his sister and who had, in 3 days of watching Phineas Easton defer to Opal's judgment in every meaningful situation while simultaneously being the kind of man who kept watch without being asked, arrived at the conclusion that the situation was perhaps not entirely objectionable. "You are going to Shenega Creek," Gerald said to Phineas, on the morning they were leaving. "Yes. That is Apache country. It is the home of people who have been moved there against their will, and who have been waiting for promised supplies that have not arrived," Phineas said. "Your sister is going to document the situation, and I am going to make sure she can do it safely." Gerald looked at him for a very long time. "She has been trying to get someone to help her with this for months," he said. "I know. The papers she writes for, the things she is writing." Gerald stopped. He looked at the floor. "She is right about them," he said finally, quietly. "I know she is right. I just wished she was someone else's problem." "She is not a problem," Phineas said. "She is a person doing important work." Gerald looked up at him. "Yes," he said, with the particular tone of a man arriving at a conclusion that has been available for a while. "I suppose she is." The road to Shenega Creek took them east and south, into country that opened up into wide grassy valleys between ranges of low mountains, the sky enormous above them and the light November clear. They rode together on Fletcher, as before, the carpet-bag repacked and the rifle in its scabbard, and the day stretching ahead of them in all its specific and irreplaceable beauty. Opal had a contact, a man named Tamaz Reyes, who ran a small trading post at the edge of the reservation, and who had been sending her letters about the conditions there for 6 months. Tamaz was a quiet, careful man who had lived on the border his whole life, and understood that trust between peoples was built slowly and destroyed quickly, and he had arranged, through considerable patience on his own part, an introduction to a man within the community who was willing to speak with Opal about what she needed to document. The man's name was Delche, and he was not a young man, not old either, somewhere in the difficult middle years that carry the weight of everything that has happened without the distance of old age. He received them in the cold morning outside a low building near the trading post, with Tamaz translating, and he looked at Opal with the careful attention of someone who has learned to read sincerity and who is looking for it now. Opal did not bring her notebook out immediately. She sat when invited to sit, and she listened, and she asked questions that were questions rather than arguments dressed up as questions, and she accepted the answers without flinching, and without the particular kind of pity that is actually about the person doing the pitying. Delshay watched her, and after a while began to speak more freely, and what he said, and what Tamaz translated was the kind of story that, once heard, cannot be set down. The promised food rations had been redirected. The promised medical supplies had not arrived. 2 children had died the previous winter from illnesses that adequate supplies would have prevented. There were families on 40 acres who had been farming for generations, and who were now restricted from the land that fed them, restricted by decisions made by men who had never seen the land and who would not have recognized it from one another. Phineas sat beside Opal and listened and watched Delshay's face, and thought about an officer's order and a camp of women and children, and the choice he had made that had ended his military career and had led him here, to this cold morning and this conversation, and this woman beside him writing everything down in her careful, clear hand. He thought, this is where it was always going. All of it. Missouri and Fort Grant and 4 years of trails and the smoldering wagon in the desert. All of it was going here. Opal wrote for 2 days at Tamaz's trading post. She wrote with the intensity of someone who has been given something important and is determined to do it justice, the oil lamp burning late both nights, her face bent over the pages, her hand moving in that clear, rapid script. Phineas brought her coffee and sat nearby and sometimes read and sometimes just sat, and the quiet between them was the comfortable kind now, the kind that does not need to be filled. On the second evening she looked up from her writing and said, "I need to tell you something." He set down the book he was not reading. "All right. When Gerald first wrote to tell me he had hired an escort," she said, "I was furious. I wrote back and told him I did not need one." He did not reply, which meant he had already arranged it, which meant that when the wagon broke down and you appeared, I was prepared to be as uncooperative as the situation permitted. "I noticed," Phineas said. "And then you said that Hector was not coming back," she said, "with that particular tone you have, the one where you are telling someone an uncomfortable truth and not apologizing for it. I did not want you sitting there waiting for a man who was not coming." "I know," she said. "That is when I decided to give you a chance." She paused, looking at her hands. "And then you kept riding past Millhaven. I asked you to, yes, but you could have argued. Most men would have argued. Gerald would have argued for an hour. You just changed direction." "The direction you pointed was the right one," he said. She looked up at him then. "You are the first man," she said, with a care and deliberateness that told him she had thought about how to say this, "who has ever ridden in the direction I pointed without either arguing first or expecting me to be grateful in a way that was really about him." He looked at her across the small table with the lamp between them and the papers spread out, and the trading post quiet around them, and said, "I am grateful that you let me come." The look she gave him was the one he had not had a name for on the porch in Millhaven, and he thought he was beginning to understand it. It was the look of someone who has been fighting very hard for a very long time and has just set something heavy down, not because the fight is over but because they have found someone to stand beside them in it. "Phineas," she said. "Yes. I am going to need someone with good judgment and reliable direction sense, and the ability to keep watch without being asked for a considerable time," she said. "The work is not going to end at Shenega Creek. The Kessler article will generate responses, and some of them will not be pleasant. The documentation from here will go to editors who will ask for more, and I intend to provide it." "Yes," he said. "I am not asking for someone to manage me," she said. "I am asking for a partner, an equal one." "I understand the difference," he said. "I know you do," she said. "That is why I am asking." He reached across the table and took her hand, the one not holding the pen, and she turned her palm up and held his, and they sat like that in the lamplight with her papers between them and the desert outside and everything still and clear. "Yes," he said. "Whatever comes next. Yes." They rode back to Millhaven at the end of the week with Opal's completed articles in the carpetbag, and a sheaf of notes and supporting documents that Delche had given her permission to share with the Territorial Indian Affairs officer in Tucson, a man who, according to Tomás, was one of the few in his position who was actually horrified by the gap between what was promised and what was delivered. Phineas had offered to accompany her to Tucson to deliver the documents in person, and she had said yes. Gerald received them in his parlor with the expression of a man who had spent the week arriving at conclusions and was now ready to present them. He looked at his sister, and he looked at Phineas, and he looked at the two of them together, the easy way they moved around each other, the way they spoke with the shorthand of people who have shared country and silence and cold camps and difficult mornings, and he exhaled. "I have a letter from Judge Hiram Wells," he said, setting it on the table between them. He wrote because Opal listed him as a reference in the Crane matter, and he wanted to offer his own endorsement of her work. He also mentioned, in passing, that he had heard she was traveling with a man named Easton who had served under General Crook's command. Phineas went still. "Judge Wells knows Crook." "They are old friends," Gerald said. "Wells wrote that he would like to meet you. Apparently Crook has been looking for good men to help document conditions in the territory, men who understand the land and who can be trusted to tell the truth about what they see." He paused. "It sounds like work that might suit both of you if you were inclined to take it." Opal looked at Phineas. He looked at her. The thing between them was bright and practical and full of direction. "We should read the letter," she said. "We should," he agreed. Gerald watched them read the letter together, their heads bent slightly toward each other, her finger tracing the relevant paragraph and his nodding, and he picked up his coffee cup and went to stand by the window and look at the main street of Millhaven, which was doing its ordinary business under the November sky, and he allowed himself to feel, cautiously, that perhaps this was not the disaster he had anticipated. The letter from Judge Wells opened a considerable door. Phineas wrote back and received a reply within 2 weeks that was specific and practical. The judge and a territorial commission were assembling documentation of conditions across the Arizona territory for a formal report to Washington, and they needed people on the ground who could travel, observe, and write with credibility and without political attachment. There was a modest stipend. There was a great deal of difficult writing in difficult country. There was the possibility that the report would be read by people in a position to change things. Opal read the commission's letter 3 times. "This is real," she said on the third reading. "It is real," Phineas confirmed. "They would commission us both. They would commission you as the writer and documentarian," he said. "I would be listed as guide and security, which is accurate." "It is more than that," she said. "It is," he agreed. "But titles on official documents are less important than what actually gets done." She looked at him. "You are remarkably unbothered by not getting credit." "Credit is nice," he said. "The work matters more." She stood and walked to the window of the room Gerald had given them in the Millhaven house, 2 rooms that were adjacent and entirely proper, and she stood looking at the street with the December light coming flat and cold through the glass. "If we do this," she said, "we will be traveling together for months, possibly a year. The conditions will be difficult." "Yes," he said, "people will make assumptions about our arrangement." "People will," he agreed. "Some of them will be wrong and some of them will not." She turned from the window. "Some of them will not," she repeated quietly. He crossed the room to her, which was a short distance and also a very long one, and stood close enough that the morning light caught the green of her eyes and the dust of travel that was still, somehow, in her dark hair, and he said, "Opal, I have been in love with you since approximately the second campfire. I am telling you this plainly because you deserve to know it plainly. What you do with the information is entirely your own decision." She looked up at him. She was not a short woman, but he was taller, and she was looking up at him with those extraordinary eyes and that expression, the one he now understood, the one that meant she was setting something heavy down. "What a remarkably practical declaration," she said. "I am a practical man." "You are," she said. "You are also kind, which people mistake for weakness and which is actually the harder thing." She put her hand against his chest, over the lapel of his coat. "I have been in love with you since you said the direction I pointed was the right one, and I refused to argue about it." He covered her hand with his. "That was day 2. I move quickly when I have made a decision," she said. He kissed her properly then, in the morning light by the window, with the street of Millhaven going on outside and Gerald presumably somewhere in the house but not in this room. And the kiss was the kind that settles a question that has been asked across 200 miles of desert and creek and limestone and starlight, and the answer it gave was thorough and unhurried and entirely clear. When they told Gerald, he sat very still for a moment. Then he said, "I expected this." Then he said, "That does not mean I was prepared for it." Then he said, "Is he good to you, Opal?" "Genuinely, genuinely," she said. Gerald looked at Phineas with the full weight of a man who loves his sister and has spent his whole life trying to protect her from things she did not need protecting from. "Take care of her," he said. "With respect," Phineas said, "she takes considerable care of herself, but I will be there." Gerald looked at him for a long moment. Then he stood and offered his hand, and Phineas shook it, and Gerald said, "That is probably the right answer," and went to find his coat because he needed some air. They were married in Millhaven in February of 1874, which was quicker than the conventions of the time strictly required and slower than Opal's personal timeline would have preferred, the compromise being the result of Gerald's insistence on a proper ceremony and Phineas's discovery that he was, in fact, very interested in doing the thing properly, because doing things properly was how you showed that they mattered. The ceremony was held in the small church on the east side of town, officiated by a minister named Caldwell who had come up from Tucson on the regular stage, and who had the expression of a man who had conducted stranger weddings in stranger circumstances, though probably not by much. Gerald stood beside his sister and managed not to look catastrophically sad, which Phineas thought was genuinely heroic of him. Deputy Travis Pike, who had ridden from the Kessler homestead to Millhaven because he had been invited, and because he was the kind of young man who rode 40 miles for a wedding when he liked the people involved, stood on Phineas's side. Martha Kessler was there. She had come with her son James, who had indeed come home to the homestead after Crane's withdrawal, and she sat in the front pew with her good dress and her weathered face and cried openly, which she said afterward was what came of a winter spent working her land in peace and having more room in her heart than she was accustomed to. Opal wore a dress of deep blue wool that Gerald had apparently arranged to have sent from a dressmaker in Tucson, and she walked down the aisle with her chin up and her eyes on Phineas, and the expression on her face was the one he now knew completely, all its layers, the settled certainty and the warmth and the thing underneath the warmth that was deeper and quieter, and that had been there since the second campfire when she had talked about her work and he had listened. He was in his good clothes, which were not extravagant but were clean and pressed, and he stood at the front of the church watching her come toward him and thought about every trail and every campfire and every ridge he had watched from, and every place he had been passing through without knowing that every mile of it had been pointed here. "I do," he said, when it was asked of him, and meant it in every direction. "I do," she said, and the certainty in her voice was absolute and her eyes did not waver, and he thought that was the most Opal Covington thing about her, that when she made a decision she made it entirely. They began the commission work in March, when the weather was passable and the territorial passes were clear. The work was exactly what the letter had described: difficult riding, difficult country, difficult conversations, and the documentation of situations that were difficult to look at and more difficult to look away from. Opal wrote and Phineas rode and watched and sometimes spoke with the men he encountered, because men who had been in the army sometimes spoke more openly to another man who had been in the army, and what he brought back to her notebooks was an additional layer of detail that made the reports more complete. They filed 6 reports over the following 10 months, and 3 of them were submitted to Washington by the Commission with formal endorsements, and the responses from Washington were slow and inadequate and partial and real. Supply deliveries to 3 of the settlements they documented were restored. A land claim dispute that had been mishandled in the territorial courts for 2 years was reopened, and this time decided correctly. These were small things against a large and ongoing injustice, and both of them knew it. But small things, done correctly, stack. Opal continued writing for the papers. The Crane article ran in the Arizona Citizen and was reprinted in a Tucson paper, and generated a letter from a reader in San Francisco, who said she had read it aloud to her reading group, and they had been moved. It also generated a letter from Aldous Crane's lawyer, which Opal gave to the territorial solicitor and which came to nothing, because Crane had withdrawn his claim in writing, and there was nothing actionable in the article, and Opal knew the difference between fact and opinion and had been careful about it. Martha Kessler sent a Christmas letter in December of 1874 saying that James had brought his family to live on the homestead, which meant 5 grandchildren running in the yard where she and Frank had stood 40 years ago and looked at the land they were going to make into something. She said she had framed Opal's article and hung it in the kitchen. She said she grew old herbs and new peach trees, and she was, in the specific word she chose, content. In the spring of 1875, Opal told Phineas they were going to need a place that was more than a trail camp, and not because she wanted to stop moving, but because there were practical considerations that required acknowledgement. He looked at her. She looked at him with that particular expression of a woman who is about to tell a man something that is going to change the shape of everything. "A baby," he said. "By October, from what I can calculate," she said. He sat with this for a moment the way you sit with very large things, letting the shape of it arrive at its proper size. Then he stood and crossed to her and put both hands gently on her face and kissed her forehead and then her mouth and said, against her hair, "Good Lord." She laughed, that real laugh, the pump-water one. "That is your response." "I have more," he said. "Give me a moment." They settled in a house outside of Tucson that had a porch and a good water supply, and enough room for a proper study where Opal could write, which she did, steadily and without stopping, because she found that writing through pregnancy agreed with her and the alternative, sitting still, did not. Phineas set up a small operation guiding surveying parties and occasional commission work that kept him useful without requiring him to be gone for more than a week at a time, because being gone for more than a week at a time when Opal was expecting was not something he was willing to do. Gerald came to visit in August, which was 3 months after he had written a letter that was simultaneously congratulatory and worried, and which had made both of them laugh when they read it. He arrived with gifts, a cradle he had commissioned from a craftsman in Millhaven, and a set of good blankets, and a jar of the same peach preserves from the Kessler homestead, which Martha had apparently sent through him on purpose, because she was the kind of woman who understood what gestures meant. Gerald held his sister's hands and looked at her with an expression that was, Phineas thought, the most honest Gerald had ever looked, stripped of the managing and the fretting and reduced to a man who was looking at his sister and seeing her happy in a way he had not quite believed in but had secretly hoped for. "You look well," Gerald said. "I am well," she said. He looked at Phineas. "You are taking care of her." "She is taking care of herself," Phineas said. "I am there." Gerald nodded slowly. "Yes," he said, "that is what I meant." The baby arrived in October, a boy, which surprised Phineas, though he could not have said why he had expected otherwise. He was born in the house outside Tucson, with a midwife named Elena Fuentes, who had delivered approximately half the children in the Southern Territory, and who told Opal She had the constitution of a woman born for difficult things and the stubbornness to match. And Opal said thank you, as though it were the compliment Elena intended it to be. They named him Francis, for Martha Kessler's late husband, which was Opal's idea and which made Phineas look at her with the kind of look that has no words behind it and does not need any. They also gave him the middle name James, which was Phineas's father's name, and which felt right in the way that things feel right when they carry the weight of all the people who came before. Francis Easton was born with dark hair and no particular opinion about anything yet, and he was, without question, the most interesting thing Phineas had ever seen. He sat beside Opal's bed in the October evening with the baby in his arms and looked at this small person who had arrived with such remarkable completeness. All the features already present, all the potential already packed in, and felt the particular awe of a man who has ridden a great deal of country and not expected to end up here. "He is going to be opinionated," Phineas said. "Obviously," Opal said from the bed, looking at them both with the expression of a woman who has just done something extraordinary and knows it. "He is ours." Gerald came back for Christmas and stayed 2 weeks and held Francis with the careful reverence of a first-time uncle who was not accustomed to small things and found this one baffling and wonderful in equal measure. He and Phineas sat on the porch one evening while Opal put the baby down, and Gerald said, in the conversational tone of a man who has been building to something, "I owe you an apology." "No," Phineas said. "I hired you to escort her to Millhaven," Gerald said, "because I thought she needed managing. I know what I thought. It was wrong." "You were worried about her," Phineas said. "I was," Gerald said. "I still am. I expect I always will be." He looked at the dark desert, the stars beginning to appear. "But there is a difference between being worried and being right about what she needs." "Yes," Phineas said. "She is happy," Gerald said. "Really happy, not performing it. I know the difference." "She is," Phineas said. "And so am I." Gerald was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The article about Crane, the commission reports, the things she is writing." He shook his head. "She is doing something real." "She has always been doing something real," Phineas said. "She just needed enough space to do it in." Gerald looked at him. "You give her that." "We give each other that," Phineas said. The commission continued its work. By 1876 they had filed 11 reports in total, and 3 of them had contributed to formal inquiries in Washington, slow and imperfect things that moved with the grinding pace of government but moved. Opal's articles were being reprinted regularly, and she had been invited to write a longer piece for an Eastern publication, a detailed examination of land rights and homestead conditions in the Arizona Territory, the kind of piece that required months of work, and that she undertook with the same meticulous ferocity she brought to everything. Francis was walking by then and had very clear opinions about his own locomotion and where it should take him, which was primarily in directions that required his parents to move quickly. He was dark-haired like his mother, and had her green eyes, and had inherited from some source that Phineas could not identify an absolute fearlessness about dogs, strangers, and large horses, which Fletcher tolerated with the dignified resignation of an elderly horse who has been told this is his purpose. In the spring of 1877, Opal told Phineas there was going to be another one. A daughter this time, she said, with the certainty she brought to everything, and she was right, which by now was not surprising. They named her Clara, after no one in particular except that the name felt right in the morning light when she arrived, dark-eyed and already looking at everything with an attention that Opal said was familiar, and Phineas said was alarming, and both of them meant affectionately. The house outside Tucson was the right size for 4, and they stayed in it. The study had shelves on 3 walls by this point, full of Opal's research and her published pieces and the commission reports, and a growing collection of books that had arrived from various directions, gifts from editors and colleagues, and once, remarkably, from Judge Wells himself, who had retired to Tucson and who came to dinner on occasion and sat in the parlor discussing territorial law and federal policy with Opal while Phineas cooked, and the children created controlled chaos in the adjacent room. The extended article for the Eastern publication ran in the winter of 1877 and was the most widely read thing Opal had written. The letters that came in response were more than she could answer individually, though she tried, and several of them were from women in other territories who were doing similar work, similar in the sense of working against similar currents with similar tools, and who had felt, reading Opal's piece, that they were not alone in it. Phineas read those letters with her in the evenings, Frances asleep in the back room and Clara in her cradle, and the lamp lit between them and the desert outside, doing its particular nighttime business of cooling and settling and starlight. He read them and understood, in a way he had understood since the second campfire and in different ways since, that the thing he had ridden into when he answered Gerald Covington's advertisement was not an escort job. It was a life, a specific, particular living life, with weight and direction and people in it who mattered, and work that was real, and a woman who was more than he had known how to imagine before he knew her. He set down the last of the letters and looked up, and she was already looking at him, her chin resting on her hand with that expression, the settled one, the warm one, the one under the warmth. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "I am just looking at you." "For a reason," he said. "Yes," she said. "For the same reason I have always been looking at you." He reached across the table, and she reached across the table, and their hands met in the middle of the lamplight, her fingers lacing through his with the ease of something that has been practiced long enough to become natural, and the house was quiet around them, and the children were sleeping, and outside the desert was doing what it had always done, vast and indifferent, and also, somehow, full of the specific light of the specific place they had made their own. In later years, when people asked how they had come to be out in the Arizona territory, Phineas would say he had come for work and stayed for the land, which was true in the way that partial truths are true when the full one is too large for the question asked. Opal would say she had come because there was work to do and she had been right, which was also true, and also not the whole of it. The whole of it was this: a smoldering wagon in the Sonoran Desert, a woman reading a book in the middle of catastrophe, a man pushing his hat back and asking if she was who he had come to find. 2 days riding toward one town and past it to another, and past that into country that needed witnesses. A limestone outcropping and a small fire, and the careful distance of strangers becoming the interested distance of people who were paying attention to each other. A creek at noon and cold feet in cold water and the first laugh. A kitchen table covered in documents, and a very civil 3-hour demolition of a dishonest man's ambitions. A porch in November and the thing said, and the thing not said, and the first permission. And then the years of it, the shape it made, the life that had direction because both of them had direction, and the directions were compatible in the deep way that matters more than the superficial ways people often check for. The commission reports, and the articles, and the homesteaders who kept their land, and the people whose stories were told by someone who understood the difference between reporting and witnessing. Francis with his mother's eyes and his own fearlessness, and Clara with her father's quietness, and her own fierce attending attention. Fletcher, who lived to a fine old age and died on a warm afternoon in the spring pasture beside the house, and who was given a proper burial in the manner of a horse, who had done everything asked of him and more. And the evenings, always the evenings, the lamp and the table and her hand in his, and the desert outside doing its infinite reliable business, and the children growing toward their own particular directions, and the sense, steady and encompassing, of being exactly where the whole long trail had been pointed. Phineas Easton had been sent to escort Opal Covington to the nearest town. He had ridden past it, and past the next thing after it, and into the life that was waiting beyond all the places a man riding for hire was supposed to stop. And every mile past Millhaven was the right mile, and every mile ahead was the right one, and the woman beside him had known it before he did, as she knew most things, and had waited with that magnificent patience for him to catch up. He caught up. He stayed caught up. And the desert stretched on around them, beautiful and enormous and entirely their own. And the story of it was the kind that has no end because it does not need one. Only a good resting place where everything that needed to happen has happened, and everything that needed to be said has been said, and the people in it are home.